My grandfather froze to death on the kitchen floor in the middle of summer, and I'm the only person who knows what happened. My mom found him early on the morning of July 15th, stretched out between the refrigerator and the breakfast table like he'd been reaching for something. His skin was blue-white, ice crystals still clinging to his eyelashes, when Mom screamed from the doorway. The thermometer on the kitchen wall read 82 degrees. I'm Theo, 17, part-time sandwich artist at Subway. Full-time disappointment to my parents' college fund expectations. Normal kid from normal Midwestern stock. The kind who knows the difference between a blizzard watch and a blizzard warning. Who can drive in snow before I can parallel park. I play JV basketball badly and work the closing shift 3 nights a week, biking home past empty storefronts and gas stations that close at 10. Nothing about my life prepared me for finding my grandfather's body that morning, or for understanding what had happened. My grandpa Isaac had lived with us for 4 years, ever since Grandma died, and Dad decided the old man shouldn't be rattling around their farmhouse alone. Grandpa was 74, with arthritis in his hands, and a habit of falling asleep in his recliner, with the TV remote balanced on his chest. He'd worked 20 years managing the local IGA before retiring, knew everyone in town, remembered their kids' names, and which checkout girls gave the best customer service. He was practical, steady, unremarkable in every way that mattered. He was also dead in our kitchen, ice cold in 80-degree weather. The coroner, Dr. Willits, spent 45 minutes examining the body. He took photographs, checked the thermostat, questioned Mom and Dad about Grandpa's health, his medications, whether he'd seemed confused or disoriented lately. He measured the room temperature 3 times with different thermometers, frowning at readings that made no sense. Hypothermia, he announced finally, signing papers with the kind of confidence that comes from 3 decades of determining cause of death. Severe hypothermia due to unknown environmental factors, possibly a neurological episode affecting temperature regulation. Dad asked the obvious question: how does someone freeze to death when it's 80 degrees outside? Dr. Willits adjusted his glasses and delivered the answer that would satisfy the insurance company, the death certificate, and everyone except me. Sometimes the body's regulatory system fails catastrophically. Medication interactions, undiagnosed conditions, stroke affecting the hypothalamus. The body can literally lose the ability to maintain core temperature. Mom mentioned the frost she'd seen around the body, but Dr. Willits dismissed it as condensation from the air conditioning. I didn't correct him, even though our AC had been off for 3 days. The funeral was on Thursday. Half the town showed up, filing past the casket to pay respects to a man who'd bagged their groceries and remembered their faces for 2 decades. They spoke about his kindness, his reliability, how he'd given their teenagers first jobs and second chances. None of them knew about the temperature of his skin when they found him, or the thin layer of frost that had formed around his body like he'd been lying there in January instead of July. None of them had seen what I saw when I came downstairs that morning, when Mom's screaming brought me and Dad running. I saw my grandfather's final expression, frozen on his face in the moment death took him. He wore no peaceful look like most people would imagine. His eyes were wide, staring at the ceiling, and his mouth was open like he'd been trying to say something important. He looked terrified. Strange things started happening 2 months ago. May 28th in Minnesota means tornado watches and sudden thunderstorms. The kind of weather that keeps you checking the sky every few minutes. It doesn't mean finding patches of kitchen floor so cold they make your feet ache through wool socks. But that's exactly what I found that Tuesday morning after Memorial Day. A circle of tile near the sink that felt like stepping on January pavement. Mom blamed the air conditioning, even though we hadn't turned it on yet. Dad checked the basement for broken pipes, crawling around with a flashlight and muttering about foundation settling. The cold spot vanished by Thursday, but another one appeared in the hallway upstairs, then another in the living room by the weekend. Old houses settle, Dad said when I mentioned it. Foundation shifts, creates drafts you wouldn't expect. Our house was built in 1987. It wasn't exactly old by anyone's standard. Dad liked cheap explanations that didn't require calling repair services. I pressed my palm against the frigid patch of living room carpet, watching my breath form small clouds in the 70-degree air. When I called Mom over to feel it, her hand passed through the cold like it wasn't there. "Feels normal to me, honey," she said, giving me that concerned look parents get when they think you're coming down with something. But I could see the frost forming on the carpet fibers where my breath hit them. The winter winds started a week later. I'd be watching TV or doing homework and suddenly smell snow in the air, that sharp, clean scent that comes before a blizzard. The smell would drift through rooms like invisible smoke, carrying whispers I could almost understand. Once I followed the scent upstairs to Grandpa's room, where he was sitting on his bed looking at old photo albums, his face pale and distracted. "You smell that?" I asked him. He looked up from a picture of him and Grandma at some company picnic. His hands were shaking as he closed the album. "Smell what?" "Like snow, like winter." "It's May, Theo." But his voice cracked when he said it, and I noticed he was wearing a sweater despite the warm afternoon. The whispers came with the wind that smelled like snow. Voices so quiet, I couldn't be sure I was actually hearing them. Sometimes they seemed to be calling a name, sometimes just murmuring like people having a conversation in another room. I'd turn my head to catch the words, but they'd fade into nothing, leaving me wondering if I'd imagined them entirely. But Grandpa heard them too. I'd find him sitting in his chair at midnight, eyes wide open, responding to things the rest of the family couldn't detect. "I'm sorry," he'd whisper to the empty room. "I know you're cold. I know." When I asked him who he was talking to, he'd look at me with the desperate expression of a drowning man. "You can hear them too, can't you, Theo?" His voice barely above a whisper. "The voices in the wind." I nodded, and something between relief and terror crossed his face. "Then you know she's coming." The shivering started in June. I'd wake up at 3 a.m, teeth chattering, pulling my covers tight around me. The room would feel normal to everyone else, maybe even warm, but my body acted like I'd been sleeping outside. When I mentioned it to Mom, she immediately started checking for fever and asking about my appetite. "Growing boys need more calories," she said, adding extra bacon to my breakfast. "Your metabolism's probably just running high." She couldn't see the frost forming on my bedroom windows while the thermostat read 75 degrees. Grandpa started acting strange around the same time, but this was different from the whispers. This was paranoia. He began looking over his shoulder when we watched TV together, checking the locks on doors that nobody ever used. During dinner, he'd pause mid-sentence and listen to sounds the rest of us couldn't hear, his fork halfway to his mouth, eyes darting toward the kitchen doorway. "Nothing there," he'd mutter when I followed his gaze. "Just tired." But tired people don't spend 20 minutes staring at the same photograph, and they don't whisper apologies to themselves while they think no one's listening. I started finding him with those photo albums more often, usually the ones from his working years at the IGA. He'd flip through pages slowly, his finger tracing faces I didn't recognize, his lips moving in silent conversation. One afternoon in late June, I found him in the kitchen at 2 a.m, still in his pajamas, staring at the spot where his body would be found 3 weeks later. The linoleum around his bare feet was covered in frost that sparkled under the overhead light. "Grandpa?" He turned toward me, but his eyes took a moment to focus, like he was seeing me from across a great distance. When he exhaled, his breath formed a small cloud between us. "She's coming," he said quietly. "She's been walking through the snow for 27 years, and now she's almost here." "Who's coming?" I should have stopped. I should have helped her. His voice was barely audible. But she was so cruel, Theo. So very, very cruel. I asked him what he meant, who he was talking about, but he just shook his head and shuffled back to his room, leaving wet footprints on the kitchen floor that steamed in the warm air. Everything came together the night I saw her, It was July 4th, just past midnight. Fireworks had been going off all evening, late celebrations from people who'd bought too many bottle rockets and didn't want to waste them. I was lying in bed, listening to the occasional pop and crackle from somewhere across town, when the temperature in my room dropped 20 degrees in the span of a heartbeat. I sat up, pulling my sheet around me, and saw her floating 3 feet above the hallway carpet. She was translucent, like looking through ice, but I could make out her basic shape, a woman in what might have been a winter coat, her hair hanging in frozen strands around her face. Snow clung to her shoulders and sleeves, never melting, never falling. She moved without walking, drifting down the hall toward Grandpa's room with the deliberate purpose of someone who knew exactly where she was going. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but watch as she passed my doorway, leaving a trail of frost on the walls where she'd been. The air around her shimmered with cold, and I could hear the sound winter makes, that particular silence that comes with heavy snow, broken only by the soft whisper of ice crystals forming. She turned her head toward me as she passed, and for just a moment I saw her face clearly. Her eyes were the color of winter sky, pale and empty and cold enough to freeze blood. Her mouth was open in an expression that might have been speaking, but no sound came out, just that patient, terrible silence. When she reached Grandpa's door, she didn't open it. She simply passed through the wood like it was made of mist. I stayed in bed until morning, wrapped in every blanket I owned, listening to the one-sided conversation that drifted through the walls. Grandpa's voice, apologizing over and over to someone who answered only with the sound of wind through bare trees. By the time the sun came up, the temperature had returned to normal, but I found a single perfect snowflake on my windowsill, refusing to melt despite the July heat. I knew then that my grandfather was going to die, and that I was the only one who would understand why. My grandfather told me the worst thing he'd ever done. It was July 13th, 2 days before we found him dead on the kitchen floor. He'd spent the morning pacing between his bedroom and the kitchen, muttering under his breath and checking door locks that were already secure. The house felt like a meat locker despite the air conditioning being off, but only Grandpa and I seemed to notice. By afternoon, he looked like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. "Theo," he said, finding me in the garage where I was fixing a flat tire on my bike. "I need to tell you something. About Mary." I'd never heard him mention anyone named Mary before, but something in his voice made me set down my wrench and pay attention. He looked older than his 74 years, his shoulders bent forward like he was carrying something impossibly heavy. When he breathed, small puffs of vapor escaped his lips despite the stifling heat. "I worked at the IGA for 20 years, he began, settling onto Dad's workbench with careful movements. Made some good friends there. Jimmy in produce, Alice in customer service, Bill who ran the meat counter." He paused, his hands working against each other in his lap. And then there was Mary. The temperature in the garage dropped 10 degrees when he said her name. She worked in the office, bookkeeping, scheduling, handling complaints. Been there longer than anyone, maybe 15 years when I started. Everyone called her Mean Mary behind her back, though never where she could hear it. His voice got quieter, more distant, like he was seeing something I couldn't. Mary had a talent for finding people's weaknesses and pressing on them until they broke. New employees, part-timers who couldn't afford to quit, anyone she thought was beneath her. But what she did to Tommy was the day I knew she was something beyond cruel, beyond human maybe. The Tuesday she destroyed Tommy was like watching a predator hunt. Tommy worked maintenance, had some kind of mental problem that made him talk slowly and repeat himself sometimes. Sweet kid, maybe 25, lived with his mother and needed that job more than anything. A customer complained about water on the floor near produce. Standard stuff, happens every day. Grandpa's breath came out in visible puffs now, and a frost began forming on the workbench where his hands rested. Mary saw her chance. She called Tommy over to the customer service counter where everyone could see. Employees, shoppers, kids waiting with their mothers. started interrogating him about his careless mopping, making her voice loud enough for the whole front end to hear. I could see the scene playing out in his eyes, 27 years of guilt etched in the lines around them. Then she started imitating his speech, made her voice slow and halting like his, stumbling over words the way he did when he got nervous. Tommy, try harder." She kept getting louder, drawing more people over to watch this grown man being humiliated like a child. The frost was spreading now, crawling up the garage walls in delicate patterns that caught the afternoon light. Tommy just stood there holding his mop, tears streaming down his face. He didn't understand why everyone was laughing. Mary wasn't done. She told the customer, loud enough for everyone to hear, that Tommy was mentally deficient and that the store kept him on out of charity. Said maybe they should find someone more capable to clean up after normal people. Grandpa's voice broke completely. The customer looked horrified, tried to say it wasn't that big a deal, just a wet floor, but Mary kept going, called Tommy a burden on decent society, and said his mother should be ashamed for inflicting him on normal people. Tommy collapsed right there, sobbing so hard he couldn't breathe. He never came back. Found out later his mother had to take him to the emergency room that night because he wouldn't stop shaking. The doctor said it was a panic attack, but I knew better. Mary had broken something inside him that never got fixed. That was the kind of person Mary was, Grandpa whispered. Someone who could destroy an innocent man for entertainment and sleep soundly that night. I asked him why he was telling me this, what Mary had to do with the cold spots and whispers that followed us through the house. His hands stopped moving. When he looked at me, his eyes were wet and desperate. Because I'm the reason she's dead. The story came out slowly, like he was pulling each word from somewhere deep and painful. February 14th, 1998, 7 years before I was born. A blizzard had moved in faster than predicted, dropping 19 inches of snow in 6 hours and creating whiteout conditions across 3 counties. Store management made the call to close early, 2 in the afternoon instead of 9 at night. Everyone was anxious to get home before the roads became completely impassable. Mary had left first, as she always did. She lived alone in a rented house on the other side of town and drove an old Buick that wasn't reliable in the best conditions, let alone in a blizzard. Grandpa had stayed another hour, helping to secure the store and making sure all the coolers and freezers were properly sealed in case they lost power. By the time he left, the snow was falling so hard he could barely see his truck in the parking lot. "I took County Road 47, he said. "It was faster and your grandmother was waiting with dinner. I'd driven that road 1,000 times. His voice got quieter, forcing me to lean closer to hear. I saw her headlights first, flashing on and off, like someone signaling for help. The Buick was nose first in a snowbank, maybe 15 yards off the road. As he got closer, he could see Mary standing beside her car, waving her arms frantically. Even through the snow and wind, he could tell she was in trouble. I pulled over, he said, sat there with my engine running, looking at her through my windshield. She was walking toward me, stumbling through knee-deep snow. The garage was freezing now, cold enough that I could see my own breath mixing with his in the space between us. I thought about Tommy crying while everyone laughed, about the way she'd called him deficient, a burden. I thought about the kind of person who could destroy someone like Tommy and sleep soundly that night. His hands were shaking now, from the cold or emotions I couldn't tell. She reached my truck, started pounding on the passenger window with her fists, screaming something I couldn't hear over the wind. Her face was pressed against the glass, and I could see the terror in her eyes. She knew she was going to die out there if no one helped her. He paused, his breath coming in short, sharp puffs that crystallized in the air. I put the truck in drive and kept going. The words hung between us like icicles. She ran after me for maybe 20 yards, waving and screaming. I watched her in my rearview mirror until the snow swallowed her up. Then I drove home and told your grandmother I'd taken the main route because it was safer. They didn't find Mary's body until March, when the snow finally melted enough for a farmer to spot something that didn't belong in his field. She'd made it almost a mile from her car before the cold took her, found frozen in a drainage ditch with her arms wrapped around herself, still wearing the same winter coat I'd seen floating through our hallway. "I killed her," Grandpa whispered, "and I've been living with that for 27 years. The frost had covered every surface in the garage now, turning our breath into clouds and making the metal tools ring like bells when the expanding ice shifted them. She's been walking through that blizzard ever since," he said. "Walking through the snow and the cold, getting closer every year, and now she's found me." I asked him why he was telling me this now, after keeping it secret for so long. He looked toward the house where shadows were beginning to gather in the windows as evening approached. "Because she's here, Theo. She's been in my room every night for a week, standing at the foot of my bed, dripping snow melt on the carpet. She doesn't say anything, just watches me with those frozen eyes." His voice dropped to almost nothing. "And I think you're the only one who can see her too." The air conditioner stayed off for the last 2 days of my grandfather's life. After his confession in the garage, he became obsessed with heat. Every time someone turned on the AC to combat the mid-80s weather, he'd shut it off within minutes, his hands shaking as he adjusted the thermostat. "Can't stand the cold air," he'd mutter, pulling on another sweater despite the sweltering house. When Dad complained about the temperature, Grandpa begged. "Just keep it off," he pleaded. "Please." The whispers were constant now. Where before I'd barely been able to make out voices on the wind, now I could hear words clearly. "Left me. So cold." They drifted through the house like smoke, always in Mary's voice, though I'd never heard her speak when she was alive. Mom and Dad noticed Grandpa's behavior, but attributed it to grief or maybe early dementia. They scheduled a doctor's appointment for the following week and talked in hushed voices about assisted living facilities and medication adjustments. They couldn't see the frost forming on windows, despite the 80-degree indoor temperature. They couldn't see the way their breath became visible whenever they stood too close to Grandpa's usual spots. When I pressed Mom's hand against a wall covered in ice, her fingers passed through it like it wasn't there. "Don't you feel that?" I asked desperately. "Feel what, honey?" She looked at me with growing concern. "Are you feeling all right?" But I could see the frost spreading under her touch, could feel the supernatural cold seeping through my clothes and into my bones. On July 14th, the day before he died, Grandpa stopped sleeping entirely. I found him in the living room at 2 a.m, fully dressed, staring at the front door. The house was stifling without air conditioning, but his breath formed steady clouds when he spoke. "She's getting closer," he said without looking at me. "Where is she?" "Right there." He pointed toward the empty hallway. "Can't you see her? She's standing by the stairs, just watching." I looked where he was pointing and saw nothing but shadows. But the temperature in that spot had to be below freezing, because frost was forming on the wall in the shape of a woman. "What is she doing?" "Nothing, just looking at me. But I can feel the cold coming off her like standing next to an open freezer. And her eyes..." He shuddered. "Her eyes are like looking into a January sky." We sat together until dawn. I held his frail, cold hand, listening to him whispering apologies to the empty air, while I watched frost patterns spread across surfaces that should have been warm. When the sun came up, he seemed to relax slightly, but I knew the relief was temporary. That evening, our house felt like an oven. The air conditioner sat silent, while the July heat pushed the indoor temperature well into the 90s. Every fan in the house ran at full speed, but they couldn't compete with the supernatural winter that followed my grandfather from room to room. The whispers started earlier than usual, just after sunset. This time they weren't random phrases, but something more focused, more demanding. I couldn't make out all the words, but Grandpa could. He sat in his chair, no longer pretending he couldn't hear her. "I know," he said to the empty room, his voice steady for the first time in days. I remember leaving you there." A pause, as if he were listening to something I couldn't quite catch. "Yes, you called my name. You begged me to help." Another pause, longer this time. The frost was spreading faster now, covering the walls around his chair in intricate ice patterns. "I'm sorry," his voice cracked. "I'm so sorry, Mary. But you have to understand what you did to those people." The temperature plummeted. My breath came out in thick clouds, and ice began forming on the inside of windows. "No," Grandpa said, shaking his head. "Sorry isn't enough. I know that now." The conversation continued for hours, Grandpa responding to accusations I could only partially hear, accepting blame for a decision that had haunted him for 27 years. Sometimes I caught fragments of her voice on the wind. "Left me to die. So cold." Near midnight, his voice changed, became resigned. "Yes, you were alone. You died alone because of me, and that was cruel. Maybe as cruel as anything you ever did. I deserve this, but please, leave my family alone. They don't know what I did," he said with a tired, dejected voice. By 1 a.m, the house felt like a walk-in freezer. Ice covered every surface I could see, turning our home into a winter landscape. The whispers had stopped, replaced by something worse, the sound of someone breathing slowly in the darkness, each exhalation bringing more cold. "Theo," he said, with all the warmth and affection he could muster, "go to bed. You can't help me. I'm ready. I'm tired, and this is nothing you or anyone should ever have to see." I went to bed knowing I'd never see my grandfather alive again, but unable to do anything except watch it happen. Mary had finally gotten her revenge, and she'd made sure my grandfather experienced every moment of the cold that killed her. The only difference was that she'd died alone in a field, while he died surrounded by the warmth of a family who loved him. It wasn't mercy. It was just a different kind of cruelty. 3 weeks later, I sent my college applications exclusively to schools in Florida and Arizona. Some things are too cold to forget, and I never want to feel winter again. The frost disappeared from our house the day we buried Grandpa, but sometimes, on the colder nights, I still hear whispers in the wind. They're fainter now, more distant, like someone calling from very far away. I think Mary is walking again, looking for the next person who left someone to die in the cold.